Oh, well, this is Philosophy for the People with Ben Burgess and Stefan Bertram. And it's the first week of the year where the show has started and it's still just daytime here. Because I now live in the land of the eternal sun,
Oh,
by which I just mean Newcastle in
uh,
summer.
fair
It's the
enough.
same place, but now it's the land of the eternal sun. Well, I should say the eternal cloud. It's
uh,
daylight, but it's just, we now get like, what is it, 18 hours of overcast day, all day.
yeah. Um, well, Southern California is certainly not the land of eternal sun. Whatever movies and TV may have led you to believe. But you know it's either really cloudy or or it's way too hot. But yeah, I'm getting. Do you remember years and years ago, like during the Obama administration, the Onion used to like. Do you remember the Onion's old Joe Biden character?
No, I don't
Okay,
know what his vibe was at all.
yeah. Well, it was a really weird joke because it's like there's nothing really about Biden that
I
suggested
mean,
this.
what I remember from the Biden presidency was he was like kind of Obama's um, intellectually challenged friend who
Yeah,
just
that
kind
was.
of followed him around.
I mean, I guess that was kind of the vibe they were going off of. But the Obama era Onion character Biden, I actually thought was like the funniest recurring bit that they did. And basically, the premise of the joke was that Biden was like a fuck up, but he was incredibly epic. That so like the classic instance of this was I remember during the 2012 Democratic convention, they did this like photoshopped image of Biden addressing the convention, uh, holding like a tall boy of beer and like with a Guns N' Roses t-shirt on, and it said. Vice President Biden says Americans are better off than they were 4 years ago, but nothing will ever touch the summer of '87. And, it was
He was
all
an anti-work king.
it was all kind of like that. Vice President Biden banned for life from Dave and Buster's was one I remember, and my and anyway, the one I've been
In
thinking about.
reality, Joe Biden, of course, 45 years old in 1987.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, the one I was just thinking about though, because I'm getting ready to go back to Mexico for a few months since I'm not doing any university teaching over the summer, so save a little rent money and do uh, log in a few months by the ocean. But it keeps making me think of this old Onion Joe Biden headline from the Obama era, which is Vice President Biden needs to cool his heels in Mexico for a while.
And the question we're answering today is Hitler a fascist?
Hitler, yes. That
Okay,
seems like a fairly
we can
clear
knock
case.
off and go to bed.
All right, good night. Yeah, no, we just actually that'd be really fun. We sort of do this along the lines of the quiz you gave me
Right. I
last time.
mean,
It's like,
there's four questions you had at the end, right? So we just did like yes, no questions. And should you
yeah,
be alarmed about Trump? Blah 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 blah. And then we just
yeah. Well, I was thinking you would just name off a bunch of people and I'd say whether or not they're fascist. So it's like
okay.
Hitler, yes. Mussolini, yes. The
And then we get to Trump, and you do like a 1 hour diversion, and I don't say
yeah,
anything. And then like an hour later, I just name someone else.
like oh yeah, there's a fascist. Yeah, yeah. I mean, Trump. I basically think no. I don't actually think so. But and part of the point of the essay is that there are two questions that I think tend to get conflated here, which is Trump a fascist and is Trump very bad?
Mm.
And I think this is like, I don't know, this is a very advanced uh insight here, but I think sometimes things are very bad without being literally fascist.
I mean, it's also an interesting question to come around in 2024 because surely, I mean, it feels like people are answering the question, asking and answering the question. the same way as it did in 2016, as if
As if
actually
the 4 years of
Trump
Trump
was
being president
president.
hadn't happened. Yeah, like that literally Trump was president for 4 years, but everybody's acting right now like that didn't happen. Or like the
What
only
was
thing they
the?
could
What
remember.
was the? Was it
I'm
this?
trying to remember. It was something like that.
I
Yeah.
think it's.
uh, yeah. I mean, it's so, yeah. I think it's a very, very weird conversation because, um, like, I saw today, I don't know if you know Nicholas Grossman. He's I don't know, pundit, kind of a national security kind of expert, I guess. And I think that's somewhat his beat. He used to be an editor at, or he still is. He still is an editor, I think, at Arc Digital Media. And he was, I saw him tweet something today about how, people say, if Biden loses, will the Democrats respond by tacking left or tacking right? How are you assuming that there will just be another election in 2028? It's like, well, I mean,
There's already been one.
yeah, Trump was elected in 2016, and then we had another election in 2020. And, it is true enough that Trump tried to steal the election. But also, it seems to me that if we're going to have a little bit of perspective on this, when I was in college, there was a successfully stolen election, which was Bush v. Gore. This was an incredibly ineffectual version of that, right? I mean, I remember, I don't know, Will or Matt or somebody on Chapo made this point like a year ago or something. Said that the January 6th is kind of what happens when you don't have somebody with the competence of James Baker to, coordinate your.
Well, I mean, it was also like 3 months late, right? Like
Yeah.
in 2000, they they made sure the votes didn't get counted properly on the day, and then the Trump campaign failed to do that, and then had to make up just like insane, weird kind of like freeman on the land, sovereign citizen arguments about like statutes from like 1781 about how actually those votes don't count because they weren't done by the parliamentarian or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, the joke I was made at the time is like some of these lawsuits were so spurious that like all these conservative judges, Trump appointed judges in several cases.
Yeah, I remember them saying stuff where like, we all support Trump here, but this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, they did everything. Like it was like one step away from just like writing "lol no" on top of the brief and like sending it back. Like it's like that's how seriously a lot of this stuff was taken. So I think even January 6th was ultimately a sign of the extreme weakness of Trump's position, right? That like, it's not like I think he would have been morally above doing a military coup if the option was present to him, right? Like it's just that you
But
would need.
that's not because he's a fascist. It's because he's a solipsistic nihilist.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the military had wanted to do a coup on his behalf,
If
he
they were
would
like,
have.
"Hey man, do you want to stay president?" He'd be like, "Yes."
It's
Obviously, he
obvious.
doesn't give a shit about democracy, but he also doesn't give a shit about not democracy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think he'd like to stay president because because he has all these legal problems just to start with, and that's
But
you
if,
know
if presidency was like a powerless position, in which case, like it grant you immunity from crimes, everyone had to listen to you, and whatever you said got on the news, but you didn't actually like you didn't have control over nuclear
Oh,
weapons
he
or
would
anything.
actually prefer that.
Yeah, yeah, you would definitely at least like not mind at all.
No, I think that would actually be his first choice. I mean, I think like I always thought that if he were given a choice between like becoming president or just having a guarantee that he would be like invited to all the particular parties that he wanted to go to in New York for the next 10 years, he would probably have taken the second one. But failing that, right, this is the best way to be in the news all the time. But yeah, I think that it's as Charles in the chat said that, I think most people don't account for the resilience of the U.S. state, which I think is definitely a true thing here. That
Yeah, I think a problem in 2016 was, and then 2020 was the deep state wasn't prepared for Trump to win the election. And
uh,
then in 2020, they weren't prepared for him to actually do this really insipid, whatever you would call January 6th and the preceding events. But they're not completely stupid, so presumably this time they are ready for both things to happen.
yeah, yeah. I think. I mean, look, Trump. So I will also say, I mean, and at some point we'll circle back and kind of do the kind of core stuff in the essay, but like, to my mind at least, right? When I think about fascism, the stuff that I think about is, to a certain extent, the sort of classic writings about fascism from like the Third International, from Clara Zetkin, uh, even the Dimitrov stuff on the Stalinist end. But like, really, I think that what probably had the most influence on me on fascism was Leon Trotsky's writings on the rise of fascism in Germany. Which I read at a tender age, and never quite got over thinking that he was basically right about the analysis of what's going on. And certainly one thing that all of those authors emphasize is the idea that fascism is basically the break glass in case of emergency way to stop a socialist revolution from happening. I mean, that's historically what it's been. And I think there are good reasons why that's what it's historically been, because I think fascism is actually pretty destabilizing, and all else being equal, like, I think just regular bourgeois democratic institutions such as they are actually like a pretty like stabilizing way of keeping things calm and kind of going about the everyday business of capital accumulation. And there tends to be a lot more there tends to be a lot more sort of chaotic things happening when you start to mess with that, and people resent it, and that's I mean, if you think about how fascism actually played out historically, with Mussolini, hanging from a lamppost or whatever, and Hitler in his bunker and all that stuff, it doesn't, I think it tends to. I think there's a reason why that's like kind of not plan A for how to govern a capitalist society. Thank you, actual Karl Marx. Appreciate that. And it's the actual Karl Marx in chat.
On
But
Twitch, just him.
yeah. But so I think that it's something they tend to resort to when they think that. And by the way, also lots of individual capitalists, end up faring very badly under fascism. I mean, like even forms of authoritarianism that stop short of that, right? There's, I mean, even if like, I don't know, I mean, I certainly don't think Russia is fascist, but like, it's certainly a much more authoritarian setup than your average parliamentary democracy. And yeah, like there are a bunch of oligarchs who do really well, but like also it is a little bit dangerous to be one of those guys, because like if you cross the big guy, right, like you have a lot less defense than you would under a different system.
Right. I mean, it's like the executions they have in China, but done less legalistically.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, yeah, it's good to be on top, but it's a very precarious position in some ways. So it's like, look, I think there are lots of reasons why business interests whose support has been historically necessary in order to bring about fascism are likely to resort to that only when they start getting panicky that the only alternative is losing it all in a socialist revolution, which I hate to tell you guys is not something we're in any danger of having happen anytime soon in the United States, because socialist revolution is not on the horizon in the United States right now. We've got like a 6% rate of private sector union density. Um, we're not there right now, and so that's like why fascism happens. And I also say, because I saw one of the comments in the Substack from my friend Gareth was giving me, a hard time about not having more explicitly spelled out, my own view about this as opposed to sort of meta criticizing the debate. And I'd say, I did say some of this, but just to like kind of circle and underline it a little bit more, that, I think the sort of Trotsky inspired definition of fascism that makes sense to me, because you don't want to just say like right wing and very authoritarian, because that seems like a much broader category than fascism. There have been lots of right wing authoritarianisms before and after, like
Right,
classical
like
fascism.
for instance, to talk about Putin, like Putin is like incredibly firmly ideologically liberal and definitely not a fascist, even while being very authoritarian.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends what you mean by ideologically liberal. I mean, he's sort of. There are some very illiberal things going on with
I
his
mean,
like.
I always just remember that bit in Tucker Carlson when Tucker Carlson was clearly trying to get some big clip about like Putin's relationship to Christianity.
Oh yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
Putin
That's
was
true.
like, actually, Islam and Christianity are the same thing, and we respect all cultures and religions in Russia.
Yeah. Well, it's also I think Putin. It's like a little bit funny because I think that whereas Putin in practice, wow, we have not only the actual Karl Marx, but Dr. Jordan B. Peterson in chat being much calmer than he usually is, saying he believes that actual socialist revolution is imminent because of the Columbia protests. That would be something Dr. Peterson would say. So that's
We,
probably really him.
we talked about that last week too.
Yeah. Uh, but yeah, it like because whereas Putin in practice does, uh, his power does rest in part on an alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church, and he's definitely like given them some very illiberal things that they want, like the gay propaganda law and various things like that. But also, like I don't know, man, he was like a KGB officer back in the day. I think he just has too much dignity to like pretend to have undergone some sort of profound spiritual experience. like,
Yeah, I mean, in that conversation, I was like, oh, wow, I hadn't really thought about it before, but you're really obviously an atheist.
yeah, right. I mean, I don't think he probably stops just short of saying the words, I am an atheist, but like, I think he just does not bother, pretending to take this stuff very seriously. Cause like, I think he sort of thinks he doesn't have to, and people don't necessarily need that from him. But yeah, so there is so yeah, I mean, I think yeah, Putin is very authoritarian in lots of ways. I mean, there are people in Russia who are like, there's the guy who went to prison because his daughter did like a drawing in class of like the bombs falling on Ukraine, and they realized that that her father had been expressing anti-war sentiments. So it's like, yeah, very authoritarian, very bad, very right wing. But I don't really think that that's fascism, right? I don't think that like Otto von Bismarck was a fascist, for
I
example.
mean, because Russia is like the opposite of like a politically activated country. Like
Yeah. So
most of
this is
Putin's politics is about kind of repressing this sort of thing.
yeah. So I think that any sort of plausible account of what was unique about fascism, as opposed to other kinds of right wing governments, movements, parties that might be in one way or
Which
another.
was a large point of what was kind of what fascism was rebelling against, right? Like
Yeah,
the Junkers in Germany as much as anything else.
totally. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Hitler had great contempt for these people, even though like he agreed with them about the evils of democracy and all that, but like he just thought that they were hopeless. They had their heads in the sand, and they didn't understand what needed to be done, in large part because, again, I think the thing that's like makes Hitler different from the monarchist Junkers, that makes that makes like fascism different from just any sort of random rule by, a right-wing general as it's existed anywhere in the world, of which there are lots of cases, is that fascism is like a mass tumultuous popular movement of right-wing authoritarianism that, certainly historically what that's looked like is that you have, um, you know, I mean, in fact, I do talk about a little bit in the essay the Rick Perlstein, not Rick Perlstein, I'm sorry, the Paxton, right? Robert Paxton definition, which is, where he talks about a mass party of nationalist militants. And I think what he's getting at there, and I think it's like an okay definition. Like, I think what he's getting at there is that you have in classical fascism, and this is what Trotsky's writing about, you have this like street fighting mass movement that, like smashes up socialists and communists and trade union halls and, all that stuff. And upon taking state power and, certainly abolishing the institutions of parliamentary democracy, eliminating labor unions, alternative political parties, alternative centers of power in general, to the extent that they can, that you get those sort of like bottom up, you know, forces of like, street thuggery will actually, supplement or even partially replace the existing institutions of state power. I mean,
Yeah.
this is actually why I thought that, uh, extremely nerdy reference point here, but like this is why I thought the original graphic novel of V for Vendetta was a better commentary on fascism than the movie, because in the movie you just got the sense that these were like, you know, just conservatives who went a little nuts.
Yeah.
Uh, and in the graphic novel, you really get a sense that it's like, oh no, this is like a society that's been taken over by a street gang, which I think in many ways is a pretty accurate description of Germany and Italy in the 30s. And so if that's what fascism is, if that's what makes it historically unique, then, uh, the stuff that people are talking about when they say like, "Oh, Trump is a fascist," I don't know, take your pick, Brexit is fascism, there's like all this, like all of that stuff, right? Is is just not that, right? I mean, it's nothing like that. In fact, I mean, you kind of said this earlier, but like a really defining feature of what, of Russia today and in a different way, the US and the UK today too, right, is the decline of mass politics in general. That even though, obviously the US and the UK are, much more democratic countries, um, like you don't have, it's kind of impossible to imagine right now, like was like the Trump youth where everybody would like, go hiking and stuff. And, that, you have you know, like mass torchlight rallies. And I understand Charlottesville, but that was like 200 fucking people in the entire country.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
that was,
I was going to bring up Charlottesville because if Trump wanted to like do fascism, if he had any interest in doing fascism, then with those guys from Charlottesville, he would have like done something with them. Like he
yeah,
would have used these parties and organizations to do something, and instead he just went out there and like did both sides, which is very disappointing. Which is very disappointing for liberals and leftists at the time, but doesn't demonstrate fascism.
yeah, right. I mean, Trump did some both sidesism at a press conference, which is gross, but it's just,
Fascism would have been recruiting the bad guys.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But it's also very different from being like, yes, let's do this everywhere. Tomorrow, I'm calling everybody out onto the streets, right? Like, that's just like Trump doing some rhetorical false equivalence, um, which is bad, right? But it's just not at all the same thing. In fact, so in one of the articles that I quote, in the essay is Andrew Morance's, piece in March in the New Yorker. It was called like "Why We Can't Stop Debating Whether Trump is a Fascist" or something like that. He he goes through the Paxson definition, and you know, one of the elements of that is a mass party of nationalist militants. And in this very way that it's like, I don't know, if you've read as much of the New Yorker as I, for some reason, I can't really justify have, then you'll kind of recognize the house style here. Everything's always at this like slightly odd, ironic distance from whatever they're talking about. And it makes it very hard to like, it's like, wait a second, what exactly are you asserting here? Right. But like it says,
Not exactly doing analytic philosophy.
yeah, the New Yorker is not written according to the standards of analytic philosophy. I'd like to lodge a complaint somewhere. But in any case, like he's doing, you know, when he does this, he says like, oh, well, so he quotes the part about the mass party of nationalist militants. And he says, well, how about when Trump told the Proud Boys to stand back and stand down? Is that collaboration with nationalist militants, or is it just, you know, whatever the milder thing he says? But it's like, look, this, like the Paxton definition, he's talking about like fascism itself being like coming to power through a mass party of nationalist militants, which is a totally different thing from purely rhetorical collaboration with, right? And like really it's just sort of a friendly nod in the direction of a microscopically tiny number of nationalist militants. Again, if you've ever actually seen like a picture of like a Proud Boys event, I don't think I've ever seen one where there were more than 100 of them together. I'm pretty sure like the DSA chapter in like a mid-sized city is vastly bigger than the national membership of this organization. But
the Republican Party doesn't have any members either, because that's just not how US politics works.
yeah, exactly. I mean, this is, and you know, and so yeah, I think I'm pretty sure there are about 200 Proud Boys in the country, of whom about 150 are actually FBI agents. But yeah, I like, you know,
And the kind of causation is the wrong way around there for Trump to be a fascist.
yeah,
If he stopped the FBI with Proud Boys, that would be fascism. But no,
yeah,
it wasn't that way around.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's just not like this is, and by the way, that friendly nod was still saying stand down, right? Like this is like he's still discouraging people from like actively going out, and you know, you could say he's talking out of both sides of his mouth, that he's too friendly to them, and it's all true, right? But like it's still, you know, it's like the gist of it is that he's not like trying to ride the wave of this. He's like, yeah, I like you guys, but don't do things that are going to be embarrassing for me, right? Like that's what he was essentially saying in that statement, right? So it's like, yeah, you have like, yeah, like groups, like all of the actual like fascist groups that like Trump, right? And it's certainly true enough that like, you know, fascists tend to, you know, with some odd exceptions here and there, you know,
Like Richard Spencer.
yeah, Richard Spencer, I think, is somehow right now in a quantum superposition state between being a very consistent fascist and just being a normal lib. But
Well, I thought when he was between being like a normal fascist and like just a normal Bernie supporter. I stopped
yeah,
following him a while ago.
yeah, I think he's more of a Biden guy, but yeah,
I imagine he transitioned from Bernie to Biden when Bernie lost.
yeah, but like, yeah, like Spencer today is very like, I don't know, he's like a very like Ukraine flag and bio kind of a lib as far as I can tell.
I hadn't followed him since Ukraine, but that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, of course, like if you're going to be a liberal Nazi, then Ukraine is like the
Yeah,
perfect
that's your
event
cause,
possible.
right? Like that's, yeah, no, I would expect, yeah, no, that's, yeah. Yeah, that's your cause, right? The alliance of, you know,
I mean, he
Azov
really
and
couldn't have expected it, but yeah, that's amazing for him, really.
yeah, I love that for him. But yeah, it's but yeah, like, and like, but there was an early stage in all this where like Spencer was saying much more fascisty stuff than he really bothers too much these days. Um, when he was like, oh yeah, Trump actually sucks, he didn't do anything for us. But like, you know, by and large, actual fascists do like Trump because he's like right wing and edgy, so you know they're gonna like that. Um, and he hates libs. The libs hate him, and that probably matters more than anything. If you're in the interest of trying, if you're in the quest to be as based as possible. But they, but yeah, I mean, it's not, but all the actual fascist groups that like Trump are teensy tiny, and they just have nothing to do with how Trump came to power the first time, or how he might come to power again this time. And certainly what you had in like the German and Italian cases, which are before they even took power, there were elements of the existing state machinery that were like basically pretty friendly to them. And like, so, even after the beer hall putsch, Hitler isn't even deported to Austria. I mean, at that point, he's still an Austrian citizen, not a German citizen. But the judge is like, oh, he seems to be a good guy. He clearly, I can't bring myself to deport somebody who, clearly thinks and feels like a German. I think that's a quote.
Well, the Jan 6 guys got fucked.
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, all in the course of the rise of fascism to power and all the historical examples, there's all this extreme gentleness by the state towards them, because it's like there's this sort of sense by a lot of people in the existing establishment that these guys might actually be pretty useful to keep around. So we're going to slap them on the wrist if they like go off killing a bunch of communists or something. Whereas, yeah, the Jan 6 guys all had the book thrown at them, like in pretty extreme ways, honestly. Like,
do you remember Disrupt J20?
Yeah.
I was looking it up, and all charges were dropped there. Obviously, they didn't get within like a mile of the White House compared to the J6 guys.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's, but like,
and also the anarchists were smart enough to like wear masks and stuff, as opposed to all the J6 guys who were like
took selfies
waving to the cameras, like writing on marquees like, I committed this federal offense here and now.
Yeah, exactly. Here's a picture of me taking a dump in Nancy Pelosi's office. Yeah. No, they were like, yeah, they were all idiots. And, but they all got the book thrown at them. And even Trump wasn't willing to, I guess, spend the political capital or whatever, or bother to like pardon any of them.
Which he thought they were cringe losers.
Yeah, exactly.
They were like low class.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, like it's so, and like to general, to your point about the parties, it's like, look, it is a significant fact that we don't actually have political parties in the U.S., right? We use the word, right? But what we mean isn't really the same thing. Like a political party in the European sense, or the Latin American sense for that matter, they definitely have them in the same way there, is like a mass membership based organization. And that's just not what the Democrats or Republicans are, right? I mean, like what these are like sort of, they're definitely kind of identity labels for broad political currents. And in practice, they're like caucuses in the House and the Senate and everything else. And they have, and they're important for how elections are structured, right? There's like, you could vote in the Democratic primary, you could vote in the Republican primary, but they're not actually.
Jeremy Corbyn was kicked out of the Parliamentary Labour Party like years ago now, but he was only kicked out of the Labour Party like 2 days ago. But obviously, that doesn't exist in the US.
Yeah, and in fact, Jeremy Corbyn was only the leader of the Labour Party in the first place because, is because support from the actual membership of the party, which again is really a concept you don't have in the US. I mean, there are third parties that are run that way, but the real ones, the big two, aren't, right? In some states, like when you register to vote, you tick a box for like registering as, which just essentially signals intention to vote in that primary. And like that's the ballot they send you. But like, again, it's not at all the same thing as being a member of an organization. And this is irrelevant.
They tried out in like the mid 2000s in the UK, like having primaries for parliamentary candidates, but now they've just gone back to them being decided on high by the party.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and this is a relevant point because, again, the decline of mass politics. I mean, fascism, whatever else it is certainly a phenomenon of mass politics. That this is something I mean, like in a way, it's like, look, I'm obviously happy that we don't have fascism, but like I think one of the reasons we don't have fascism is ultimately a bad thing, which is just that like to
We're too
really do
nihilistic.
to really do fascism, people would have to leave the house.
Yeah, yeah.
Like you have to go out and participate in civic life, to really get those armies of fascist street thugs going.
And even if
Um,
you had like a massive wave of kind of like identitarian street violence that burnt itself out after a few months, you wouldn't have fascism any more than we had socialism after the 2020 events.
yeah, yeah, no, I think that's right. I think you need like a stable like movement. Um, so if you think about classic examples, like, look, I think like the KKK back when that was like a real mass organization, I think,
Oh, yeah, that's
even,
definitely American fascism.
yeah, that's American fascism, even
In
though
all
it
its goofy wizardness.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Even though it predates the F word being invented in Italy, it's definitely a clear example, right? So that's that's fascism. But like, look, just having like racist riots of the course that existed, happened lots of times in American history, by itself doesn't amount to fascism happening, right? I mean, that's like if they were being carried out by like a sort of mass movement that had some enduring power and long-term political goals and all that stuff, then yeah, that would be fascism. But and it's also important to kind of note, right? So I think January 6th changed, like I've mentioned Robert Paxton a couple times. I think he changed his mind after January 6th. Was like, no, there actually is American fascism here. And I can definitely understand that as like an impressionistic response to that. I mean, incredibly shocking event at the time. Like,
I must say, it was perhaps the funniest day of my life. January 6th
who tell?
was incredible.
um, yeah, okay.
Did
I thought there was going to be
did you
more
find
from
it
that.
stressful?
I found it bizarre. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd say stressful exactly, but definitely kind of horrifying. I mean, it was funny insofar as that was back, like right now I'll do movie streams with like Jason and Teray, like, once every month or two. But like back then I was doing movie streams once a week. And so so it was on Wednesdays is when I was doing those. And so it was Wednesday, January 26th, that afternoon. I spent I spent the afternoon watching Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets so I could talk about it on the stream as my like phone was buzzing on the table. And then like I finally finished the movie and checked my text. And I was like, oh shit, we can't really do a stream about this, can we? Like because it was like actively still going on at that point. They hadn't left the Capitol. And so we ended up just doing an impromptu stream with Varn and some other people to talk about what was going on, and then YouTube took down the stream because we said too many keywords, I think.
You were part of the insurrection.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean it is like a shocking event, right? That there's a rioters who are being egged on in however ambiguous a way they're being egged on by sitting president, certainly whipped up by the crazy lies he was telling.
Yeah, I mean,
um
they're certainly doing it for Trump, regardless
yeah,
of what
yeah,
Trump thinks about them.
yeah, exactly. And I think Trump's initial reaction was like, "Oh, cool, they're doing it for me. They like me."
It's
And
like,
then he was
damn,
like,
my guy's doing something.
"Yeah, exactly. Finally, somebody's doing something for me.
Yeah, I
Awesome."
guess is what you would think.
And then as the afternoon dragged on, he was like, "No, actually, these guys are kind of embarrassing."
These guys are kind
Uh,
of.
so I
Yeah, and of
should.
course, then you had like Walmart coming out and being like, "We support American democracy."
Yeah, well, actually, there was a point where where like the national,
Yeah, like the
like
National Business Board, whatever it's called, the
yeah, yeah,
National Chamber
exactly,
of
right. So it's
Commerce.
yeah, I don't know if it's Chamber of Commerce was the Manufacturers Association, but yeah, one of the big like business
The
associations.
guys that you need to do fascism.
Yeah, actually, not only did not support it, but like actually like issued a statement where they wanted like Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment to get rid of Trump because they're like, okay, what the fuck, you can't do this,
Yeah.
guys. This level of chaos is really bad for business. And yeah, I think that so like I get the sort of shockingness of it, but I also think that on sort of calmer reflection, uh, it's like, well, hold on though. One thing, as much as I understand, like people always want to emphasize who are on the sort of yes, Trump's a fascist side of this, like, oh, Hitler moderated some of his rhetoric in 1932 and whatever. It's like, yeah, 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 okay, but like in say the beer hall putsch several years earlier, the event that everybody wants to compare January 6th to, um, which was January 6th was a overwhelmingly civilian, mostly unarmed mob of sort of disparate rioters. There were definitely like paramilitary kinds of right wing groups that were there, right? But like that's not most of who was there, and you can kind of tell because they just sort of didn't know what to do when they got inside. I mean, it was like the old Far Side with the car that's turned over and the dog on top of it. He finally caught the car. It's like, well, now what do I do? That they uh, Beer Hall Putsch was an attempt by a very well organized, armed paramilitary group who had a plan, to overthrow parliamentary democracy and impose a dictatorship. That was explicitly how they understood what they were doing, right? They could not have been clearer about the fact that they thought democracy was bad and they wanted to get rid of it. And, as half-assed as the plan was, right? It's nonetheless true that like that's what they understood themselves to be doing. And I think it's not a small point that most of the January 6 idiots actually thought they were defending democracy because they had been whipped up by all of these, asinine lies about how, it was the Venezuelan voting machines and, like whatever, like that really Trump won, right? Like that they thought they were defending the actual winner of the election against the deep state stealing it. And which again, I think is not an insignificant point. Doesn't mean that what they did is okay or, anything shouldn't be prosecuted, anything like that. It's just a really important disanalogy between these two events.
And he kind of
That
showed like the limits of the degree to which, America's up for fascism in like the police allowed the January 6th protesters to do far more than they would have let an equivalent
Yep,
left wing group do. Like they
no
would not
question.
have even got to their start point if they were a group of leftists. But in the end, they did just shoot Ashley Babbitt in the neck,
Yeah, totally. Like I think
who was like an unarmed whatever.
yeah, totally. I mean, I actually honestly found it pretty hilarious. Uh, you know, on like January, so you were saying you thought January 6th was funny, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there's nothing funny about it, but like there were definitely funny things about what happened. But
You
like,
enjoyed January 7th.
yeah. Well, January 7th, I thought it was fucking hilarious how many people who were police abolitionists on January 5th were like praising the decision to shoot Ashley Babbitt.
Right.
Uh, and it's like, well, wow, okay.
This is
Uh,
the bullet in the neck which saved democracy.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's quite a shift.
Yeah, and of
But
course a lot of people that were cop lovers during the last summer also changed their mind the other way.
oh, totally, yeah. I mean, to a pretty hilarious extent in both cases. That because it's like, yeah, we like it. We like the cops when they're beating up people that we don't like, right? But what is this? This is like now you're yeah, like it's like it. I mean, yeah, it's like these guys all hate the FBI now because they raided Mar-a-Lago. Um, which again is very confusing ideologically. But yeah, I I think that there were definitely at least some of the cops who did actually let rioters into the Capitol because they just like instinctively thought they were their kind of people,
Right.
right? I'm sure most of the cops are Trump supporters, all that, but then when push came to shove, it's like, okay, you guys are really getting out of hand. So then you have all these cops fighting with rioters. You have Ashley Babbitt, be shot for like trying to get inside a place that she wasn't allowed inside. And then later again, you have the whole apparatus of the justice system really like coming down on these people like a ton of bricks. Because like, no, you really like we can't allow this, right? This isn't gonna happen. And in fact, I mean, I one point that like a couple weeks later, Danny Bessner and I wrote the article I quoted in this essay, which was originally published under a different name in Jacobin, but it was republished in the collection that Morantz was reviewing. Did It Happen Here? Under the title "What's in a Word?" And one of the things we said that I would stand by is that, like, honestly, I'm just less worried about the threat to democracy from like rowdy mobs than I am about increasing authoritarianism from within the existing machinery of state power. And as such,
Right. I mean, Spencer was saying earlier in chat that more than January 6th, the threat to kind of democracy and freedom, whatever, was the authoritarian laws which were justified by January 6th.
yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I actually, yeah, I mean, we kind of, Bester and I kind of said that in our article, and we had, and I wrote something in the Nation at the time called "Prosecuting Everyone Who Breached the Cap," prosecuting every participant. Anyway, something like that. Prosecute everybody would be a mistake. That was the gist of the title, which is, to this day, I mean, that was 4 years ago, and to this day, that's like one of the big pieces of evidence that people will pull out to show that I'm red brown or whatever. That I wrote this article saying that prosecuting everybody would be a mistake. But my argument there was just like, look, if
That little lady that was doddering around probably doesn't need to go to jail.
yeah, and in fact, I worry about the precedent that's being set there, right? Because in fact, this is a precedent that's been explicitly appealed to by many people facing rowdy protests since then, right? It's like, oh, see, well, if you're going to defend, defending the lawlessness of the, Columbia protests or whatever is like, is like defending January 6th, right? People use those kind of metaphors all the time. It's like, look, I don't actually think that trespassing on a government building in the course of a protest is the sort of thing that, we should have a really draconian state response to. And in fact, I worry a lot about the long-term consequences of establishing the precedent of everybody thinking it's okay to come down.
It's going to be great when Trump wins, and then they do disrupt J20 again, and the Democrats are like, we need to put these anarchists in prison to defend sovereignty.
Exactly. Like, yeah, it's like, I don't know. What about I mean, it's like there are lots of examples of government buildings being stormed or occupied by protests that I like, right? I mean, you think about like Wisconsin, during the like anti-union legislation, all that. So yeah, I mean, look, anybody who actually did anything violent, sure, whatever, prosecute them. But like just random people who just entered an area that they weren't supposed to go into.
Right. I mean, I'm learning that in the US, the greatest crime you can commit is trespassing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's so. I totally agree with Spencer's point about that, and and I think, yeah, in general, look, I mean, what's the, this actually does take us to one of the points that's explored in the essay, which is the Trump Bush comparison, which is because it's like amazing to me because a big component of the, what Danny Bessner, with his characteristic bluntness, calls the fascism ambulance chasers. A big component of that coalition of people sort of crying fascism are these like Bush era neocons, David Frum, people like that. And it's like, look, by any reasonable standards, I mean, if a big part of like what's characteristic of fascism is that you're remaking the traditional machinery of the state in a much more authoritarian way. Look, Bush did that way more than Trump did. Like not even close. I mean, this is, you know, like, Trump, we can certainly rattle off bad and authoritarian things that Trump did, and I would agree with all that. But like, Trump did nothing that compares to the Patriot Act, you know, the mass surveillance after 9/11, indefinite detention,
He
worldwide
didn't even invade anyone.
permission. He didn't know permission slips for torture and CIA black sites around the world and, Eastern Europe, all that. Like, this is, I mean, all of that is like way more of an authoritarian threat than anything that could be done by sort of rowdy mobs getting violent. And so it's like I think in general, I think it's bad politics to sort of see the predominant danger coming from the latter and not from the call coming inside the house, right? The national security state. So yeah, I mean, I think that the real focus, and we've kind of talked around this, but to be clear about this, the sort of focal point of the article and the reason why, I mean, this is all, everything we've been talking about is, politics, right? But like, the real tie-in to more sort of theoretical questions that the Substack's typically about, is thinking about, because I want to do two things in the essay. And the second is to think about everything we've been talking about, the sort of, larger background political questions. But the first one is to think about like what the rules even are of this game, right? Like if we're debating whether something counts as fascism, well, how are we defining fascism? What's going on here? And it's something that people who, are on the side of everything is fascism is coming for us, typically just are oddly uninterested in doing. So like Morantz in the New Yorker piece says like, well, of course, if you insist that fascism is strictly a historical phenomenon in Europe in the 20s and 30s, then nothing after can count as fascism. But if you have a broader definition, it gets more subjective. It's like, well, hold on. Are those the options? Either that it's like a proper name for a phenomenon, a particular historical period that can never occur, or it's just all kind of feels, that it's just vibes. Because it seems to me that quite a bit of philosophical activity from like Plato onward is precisely about trying to define important but elusive terms by kind of thinking about clear examples and their features and what seems to be important about them, and using that to extract definitions in a form of necessary and sufficient conditions. Well, anything that fulfills X, Y, and Z counts, and anything that doesn't. And then people will come up with counterexamples to challenge that definition, which are either going to be examples that that really feel like they should count but don't fit the definition, which shows the definition is too narrow, or things that clearly don't count but do fit the definition, which shows the definition is too broad. So whether we're talking about like Socrates bothering the citizens of Athens to justify, explain justice or holiness or whatever, or last month's pile of academic journals where people are arguing about knowledge or free will or whatever, like that's like a certain kind of like semantic game that I can understand. I get what the rules are, right? And there are different objections that people can make to whether those are good rules or whatever. There's whether this is like a good activity, all fine, right? But like what I want to call attention to here is it's like, look, if you're doing that, I understand what you're doing. I kind of know how to evaluate the claims, but it's really interesting to me how little interest most of these people have in doing that. Because, look, you absolutely could have a definition that's not purely historical, that does say like, yeah, this is something that maybe happened earlier, like with the KKK in the US, that could very well happen again in the future, right? There's no reason it couldn't. While still having a tight enough definition that it's not just sort of based on general vibes and, impressions that like, again, you say, is there a street fighting mass movement of nationalist militants that's, aims to overthrow parliamentary democracy and et cetera, right? Like maybe that's too narrow, but I mean, it seems like it's somewhere in the right range. And, and of course, if so, that would capture all the classical examples, and it would definitely not capture like the MAGA wing of the Republican coalition. And people, but yeah, that's that sort of activity of conceptual analysis. People who are on the it's literally fascism bandwagon seem to have remarkably little interest in doing that. So I have these conversations all the time where people say, "Oh, it's fascism." You say, "Well, fair enough." I don't think that either of those guys would have been particularly good in a fight. But although Plato and Aristotle would make good fist names, just putting that out there. But yeah, I think that like oftentimes the way this conversation goes is that you point somebody like me or people who are really into this, like Bessner, Daniel Steinmetz Jenkins, Samuel Moyne, will point out the many, many disanalogies between, like clear cases of fascism and what we're talking about here. And then the response will be like, yeah, but that was like classical European fascism. We're talking now about 21st century American fascism. It's going to have different.
They don't tell you what that is, apart from it's Trump.
Yeah, exactly. They don't tell you what it is. It's like, okay, but by virtue of what are you calling this fascism?
And if it's some new whole thing, why do I care?
Yeah, I mean, like, you're still, even though you think there are important differences between different kinds of fascism, fine, but by virtue of what are these both kinds of fascism and not something else, right? Like what's the thing about it? What's the thing about them that makes them specifically fascism? And if you haven't told me that, I really don't know how to evaluate this claim. And oftentimes there's this sense that you get when people are pushing back against this, where they're like, oh, you're just nitpicking and you're just like splitting hairs and none of this matters that much. If it's not fascism, it's goddamn close enough and you should stop minimizing this. And it's like, I mean, slow down here, because for one thing, why is this minimizing? Like, again, circle back to where we started. Is it not possible for some things to be bad, in fact very bad, without being fascism?
And like, it's possible for there to be something that's worse than fascism.
Yeah, there could even be things that are worse than fascism. I think if, democratically elected Northeastern liberal John F. Kennedy had decided to fire nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that would absolutely not have been an instance of fascism, but it would have been the end of organized human life on Earth, and that would have been bad. In fact, not only bad, but worse, more bad than fascism. So yeah, no, absolutely. Like you can even get things that are more bad than fascism that aren't fascism. Fascism is a particular kind of, don't get me wrong, very, very bad thing, but it's, but not all badness needs to be fascism. Like you can, like, this is ultimately what annoys me the most about this. Just put crassly, can you really not get it up to oppose bad things that exist now if you haven't first classified them as reincarnations of the interwar European bad thing? Like why, and like, I think the fact that people have so much trouble doing that sort of bothers me in itself, because it's like, yes, this is like the last like sort of moral narrative we could all get excited about. It's like World War II.
Right, it's one of the very few things you can call, and everyone has to say like, yeah, that's a bad thing. The other one being like racism, racist.
Yeah, totally. Right. Which is why, yeah, it's like I get the sense, like, I don't know if you follow Sam Hasselby on Twitter. He's always talking about this, that it's like so many libs need to constantly find ways of play acting a reenactment of liberalism's heroic periods. So it's either that they're like 1930s anti-fascists, or that they're like 1860s radical Republicans. And
Well, on 1960s SDS, so they're really exciting.
yeah. At best, although usually it's not that because that's a little more
Probably have to wait a
controversial.
few more years until everyone's actually forgotten what they were about.
Yeah, exactly. Usually yeah, sometimes it might be like the civil rights movement. That's like a fairly that's like that has that same kind of consensusy feel to it. But yeah, otherwise it's either like the 1860s or 1930s because yeah, if you're fighting Nazis or Confederates, everybody understands why that's like a great heroic thing you can get excited about. And it certainly sounds a lot better than just being like, yeah, I'm defending the status quo with some incremental improvements here and there over the course of time.
Against those guys who'd be centrist in 1980.
like, like that's, yeah, that certainly sounds a lot better. It certainly sounds a lot more exciting. And it's also like, it also just bothers me because I think there's a larger thing here, which is like, I think in some ways it's even more disturbing when I see it on the left. Cause it's like, look, we at least should be able to get excited about just like fighting inequality and for its own like isn't having like a really unequal society just bad in itself? Like does everything always have to be World War II or the end of the world, or like it's always like I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things I say in the essay is like if Karl Kautsky was right, to say that it's either socialism or barbarism. I think the kind of barbarism we're mostly facing right now isn't the end of the world or literal fascists like building concentration camps and banning all opposition parties. It's more just the usual day-to-day barbarism of the money commodity, money star, death wheel doing its thing in the background, while we have sort of overseen by these kind of miserable half democratic political institutions, and lots of foreigners that nobody particularly cares about being murdered by the military industrial complex. I mean, like that's the kind of barbarism that I think is the actual alternative to socialism right now. And I kind of think we should be able to get excited about opposing that without having to translate it into terms of this sort of consensus story about the last thing that we were all excited about, which was like defeating Hitler.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big problem which we see happening now when you try and exploit these universal narratives for whatever end you want, which is that in the end they end up not being universal narratives. Like at the moment, there's a big thing where everything is being called anti-Semitism,
Yeah,
and up until now, everyone, well, nearly everyone, accepted that anti-Semitism is like obviously bad and associated with like the worst event in history. But if you keep insisting that all this stuff is anti-Semitism, that doesn't lead to everyone being convinced that all college students are like advocates of the Holocaust. It makes people go, "Oh right, I guess anti-Semitism isn't so bad. I guess
totally.
anti-Semitism, or
No,
like
this is
maybe sometimes it's bad and sometimes it's good. Like I'm not sure, but like
yeah, no, this is absolutely. I mean, this is like Kuba's point about about identity politics, where he'll say that it's in the long term, it's probably a bad idea to encourage white people to spend this much time thinking about being white. And like I think there's a pair.
I think that I don't know if you got it from him, but that was a Colin Kilpatrick quote
Okay, yeah, yeah,
from
yeah.
2016.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, but yeah, true, though, right? And yeah, I think I got it from Kuba, who I guess was probably getting it from Connor. But yeah, but then like, look, I think that I think there are parallel points here. It's like, yeah, I absolutely think that. I actually uh, almost posted the other day, and then I decided that it would lead to an argument that'd be really annoying. Uh, the most identitarian framed thing that I've ever almost put on social media, which was speaking as. Somebody, uh, somebody whose family fled from what was then the Russian Empire from honest to God pogroms. I don't think it's a good.
Jewish style individual.
I don't think it's a good idea to desensitize people this much to charges of anti-Semitism. I think in the long term, that's probably a really bad idea.
Yeah,
Like,
but obviously, like nearly everyone that's saying this stuff doesn't give a shit about like normal American Jews, right?
yeah, sure,
Like
but like,
obviously, the Israeli government has got no interest in the rest of the world not being anti-Semitic, or as long
no, I
as
mean,
it's on like a popular level and not a governmental one.
yeah, I mean, quite the opposite. I think they actually
Right.
benefit from popular anti-Semitism because it encourages the central premise of the Zionist project, which is see, the only place you can be safe is here, come here. The only place you can be accepted maybe is here, come here.
And if
So
you're in a foreign country, you should act like the anti-Semitic trope of always having your first loyalty to us.
yeah, exactly. I mean, look, that honestly, I think that from an Israeli government point of view, the ideal thing would be for other countries to be pretty anti-Semitic but also pro-Israel. Like, if they can get that combo right, I think that's what they
Yeah,
that's
like all the Jews left in the rest of the world are all like incredibly wealthy
uh, yeah,
oligarchs who common people hate and rich people have to kowtow to. It's like literally it's just like the most racist anti-Semitic
yeah,
stereotype of the world would be the one that would be best for them.
yeah. But like, yeah, I think it's a terrible idea to like to desensitize, yeah, because I think there are lots of people over the course of time, it's like, yeah, the charge is just robbed of its power. And similarly, I think if everything is fascism, then I mean, I know the point, like when people say, oh, you're minimizing the badness of Trump when you say Trump isn't a fascist, and I know the point people think they're making is, it's like, oh, you've got to call it fascism because that way people get excited about it. But it's like, yeah, maybe to some extent, but like I think that's going to have diminishing returns over time. I think over time, people, rather than people getting more excited about the things you're calling fascism, opposing the things you're calling fascism, people are just going to get less worked up about the fascism label, right? Because it's like, oh yeah, sure. So we have like about half the time we're governed by fascists, right? So it's clearly not that big a deal. My life doesn't change that much. Um, that's so like it doesn't really have that four alarm, oh my god, fascism, we need to stop fascism. It's just like, oh yeah, that's a thing that's out there that's bad, I guess, right? To the extent that people are taking you seriously, or to the extent they're not taking you seriously, it's like it just has the usual crying wolf effect that it's like, oh, you called this fascism, yeah, you called all this other stuff fascism too, why should I take you seriously this time? So yeah, I mean, I think ultimately my conclusion in the essay is just like, look, given that nobody who's pressing this charge, I mean, even people like Jason Stanley, who's a philosophy professor, who's like one of the big participants in the debate on the yes, it's fascism side, even I don't see him like trying to come up with a definition of fascism that this will fit. Maybe he does, but like the stuff I've seen by him, he'll just sort of say, oh, look at how the rhetoric of this stuff is similar to fascist rhetoric. And I'm not even saying it's entirely wrong about that, but to me, I would just say it's like, look, nationalism, xenophobia, these are all like deep wells that various kinds of right wing movements are going to draw on. That just makes the uninterestingly obvious point that fascism is a phenomenon of the right. I mean, I know Peter Hitchens will dispute, but true. As opposed to making the point that people think they're making, which is that fascism is that like, oh, see, this is like really telling that it's fascist. Like, well, look, right wing movements before and after fascism have drawn on those rhetorical wells. That's to be expected. Like, that doesn't tell you that much. So, like, given that nobody in this debate, like on the yes, it's fascism side, seems to be interested in engaging in any kind of rigorous process of trying to figure out exactly what fascism means. Uh, it seems much more vibes based. And two, the effect of crying wolf over fascism all the time is to rob the term of its emotional force. Then I would say what I would get out of those two things is just like, look, the debate about whether it's fascism is unlikely to be productive, and just sort of throwing it around in a not particularly rigorous way is unlikely to have good consequences. So why don't, instead of arguing about whether it's fascism, because there doesn't really seem to be a very serious case for that, why not just argue about the things that you're trying to say when you call it fascism? Like, why not figure out what we're actually arguing about and arguing about that, right? So, like, yeah, I give a few questions at the end. I think they were like, how alarmed should we be about the fact that Trump is probably going to be president again? Is Trump significantly different from like how much continuity is there between Trump and previous Republicans, and to what extent does he represent something new? And there was like one other I'm not remembering, and then there was like, should like leftists who live in swing states vote for Biden? Despite the genocide in Gaza. Um, and
How,
it's
how
like,
alarmed should we be at Trump's election? At what extent is Trump continuing to feud with Republicans? Would Trump being elected this time make it more likely that Republicans would succeed in stealing further elections, and then the voting thing?
yeah, yeah, and it's like, look, those are all interesting questions, and I think if we just skip directly to arguing about those, like instead of routing it through this strange semantic argument with very unclear rules about the fascism terminology, if we just directly argued about those things, that I imagine people who have different opinions about whether Trump is fascist would have different opinions about those questions. I mean, for whatever it's worth, I guess my quick takes on them would be that I think I'm skeptical about the idea that like our kind of mediocre bourgeois democratic institutions as they exist would cease to exist if Trump was president. A lot of that skepticism has to do with the fact that not some people seem to be unaware of this, but he was actually president already. That happened for 4 years. So I think that gives you at least some indication of what he would do as president. So, I mean, could there be like more effective moves to steal further elections? Maybe. But like, are we basically still going to have elections where sometimes Republicans will lose? I kind of think we will. Um, I mean, maybe I'll be wrong about this, but I see very little reason not to think so. Um, and even the extremely conservative Supreme Court, seems awfully skeptical of the idea. I don't remember if this ruling came out yet or not, but they definitely at least did the oral arguments, like the idea that states can just substitute different slates of electors or whatever. They seem to think that that's obviously not okay. Um, so I think probably we will in fact continue to have elections that Republicans sometimes lose if Trump is elected again. You know, how alarmed should you be? I mean, look, I'm not a there's no difference guy. I think there are obviously differences between Democrats and Republicans. That's a normatively neutral statement. I mean, that's just like calling balls and strikes about what exists in reality, right? There are clearly policies that Republicans typically support and Democrats typically oppose, and vice versa. Um, and some of them matter, but um, but I also think that, yeah, to the extent that there are definitely differences between Trump and Biden that are important, but I also think that most of those would have also been differences between Trump and like a Romney president, or Biden and like a Romney presidency. That like most of the most lasting damage that Trump did was from things like appointing conservatives to the Supreme Court who got rid of federal level abortion rights, which of course is a thing that McCain or Romney would have absolutely done. They would have
But
gotten
if Romney had been president, there would have been like loads of briefings and editorials in the New York Times about how Romney was going to appoint like a liberal judge for at least like one of the spots, and then he just appointed conservative.
yeah, that sounds right. But like, yeah, like this is like, look, Romney, McCain, Marco Rubio, Trump, any of these people would have gotten the same list from the Federalist Society of judges, and they pretty much would have gone with that. Any of these people would have appointed hardcore union busters to the National Labor Relations Board, like Trump did. George Bush certainly did. So it's like, yeah, these are all ways in which Trump is very bad, but I think these are mostly ways that he's just bad because he's a Republican, not because he's like some special new kind. Um, I think some of the cruelty at the border, is somewhat unique. Although even there, I think if we're really hard headed about this, there were more deportations under Obama. So let's keep that in perspective a little bit. But yes, some of the particular elements of like base pandering, extreme cruelty that Trump did were somewhat unique. But like, so it's like, I don't know
And
how.
obviously, in extreme cruelty, Biden's been really trying his best to make sure there's no difference the past 9 months.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of the most amazing example of Trump Biden continuity because like, we've somehow gone all the way from like 2018 when the main reason you were supposed to think that Trump was a fascist was, kids in cages at the Mexican border to 2023, or, yeah, early 2024, where like you were supposed to think that, oh, the Republicans were being irresponsible and showing that they're not fit to govern because they wouldn't come together with Democrats to do a bipartisan border security bill that would have done a lot of the Trump wish list. So, it's definitely, yeah, the extent of
Right, so,
different.
so they can send more guns to Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there was that really charming bit of bipartisanship where it's like, okay, some Democrats aren't that enthusiastic about Gaza, some Republicans aren't that enthusiastic about Ukraine, but everybody came together in beautiful bipartisan harmony to agree to fund one another's wars, and, in tandem. So, yeah, I mean, I think like how alarming is it? I mean, I'm not happy that Trump's going to win again. Probably, I would prefer that he not, but I wouldn't. I don't really think it merits sort of American democracy is coming to an end level of alarm. And as far as like what people should do in swing states, like, look, I'm very grateful that I live in California, and this is a non-issue for me. There's no reason whatsoever to, consider pulling the lever for Genocide Joe. So, I don't know. Look, if people live in swing states and they vote for Biden, they hold their nose and vote for Biden and go home and throw up because like they're concerned about judicial appointments and National Labor Relations Board appointments and, some, and like degrees of harm reduction or whatever. I can understand that. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. If other people in swing states are absolutely unwilling to do it because they can't look past the growing mountain of Palestinian corpses, I think that's also totally understandable. I have zero interest in scolding anybody about any of it. That's really just not how I choose to spend my time.
Yeah, I mean, I usually say to people, don't vote, but by what I mean by that is like, don't give in to the blackmail. That
Yeah.
regardless of what you do, it doesn't really matter very much. But
No,
that means at the same time that if you particularly really want to vote for Joe Biden, then knock yourself out.
yeah, I did. I just think that like I think liberals and ultra leftists often come together in sort of over moralizing this to a ridiculous extent. That like honestly, what atomized American voters do in the ballot box with the dismal, awful choices that our stupid half democratic system leaves them is just not that big should not be that big a political priority one way or the other. Like, if I mean, I'm certainly gonna like. I don't know. I mean, people are ridiculous about this. I mean, the example that's funniest to me now, thinking back to it, is back in like 2022 is when John Fetterman first ran for the Senate, right? And I wrote an article during that campaign for Jacobin. Uh, it had like actually a super conciliatory title. It was called "John Fetterman is right about many things, but he's dead wrong about Palestine." And people got angry at me that I wrote that article because I was like undermining, the election, and like I was like helping Dr. Oz, win the Senate seat because I was like, undermining enthusiasm about Fetterman, which is hilarious for many reasons, especially
And
now.
Fetterman, while turning out, I guess, to be a centrist for the US Senate, is the
Yeah.
most cringe guy in there.
Yeah. well, I mean, it's really funny now because like John Fetterman is like a internet leftist, like is like a super villain for internet leftists now. Like everybody hates the shit out of that guy, and he's certainly earned it, fair and square. But like at the time, it's like, look, even assuming that Fetterman was much better than he turned out to be, and I mean, on certain issues he did have better signaling or whatever, but like even if he had turned out to be much better, it's like I'm not really like, what do you people think this is? I'm not drawing a salary from like the Fetterman campaign or the, Democratic, congressional campaign committee or whatever. Like
I'm not betraying the party line because the party doesn't exist.
yeah, exactly. It's like, yeah, it's like, what do you think this is? It's like American, do you think like the American socialist left, such as it is like a faction within like a Leninist version of the Democratic Party that like, agrees at the party Congress about what the line is, and then everybody has to toe it? Like that's not what any of this is. I mean, I'm going to say things that I think are true, and like if that affects anybody's political behavior, then so be it. But I mean, like I don't. I'm not like also like regardless of whether one outcome is slightly better than another outcome or whatever. It's like, yeah, I would certainly like to, if we ever, it's like if we ever get a left that could actually of the kind that could actually like take power and do things, then I would obviously be an enthusiastic supporter of it. But like right now, I'm just kind of writing stuff because I think it's like true, and I want to like, like I want to make arguments to convince people that the stuff that I think is right, and like this is commentary right now. I mean, this is you know build a movement that could do something, and I will happily consider becoming a disciplined member of it. But like that's just not where we're at.
I would love to be a fellow traveler of a mass communist party.
Yeah, right. Totally. Like
It's
that's
not written in my stars right now. Ben,
yeah, yeah. You got to give me the party before I can become a fellow traveler of it. Like there's an order
yeah.
in
It's
which
not the
these things
Democrat Party. It's not the Labour Party. So
would have to happen. I mean, right now I'm just a guy who writes articles and does podcasts, but like they have a, I'm look, I am taking applications for mass parties that want me to be a fellow traveler of them. Go for it. I will carefully consider your application on its merits. I haven't gotten one yet.
what's on the docket for next week, Ben?
Yeah, what's on the docket for next week? What's on the docket for next week is a essay. There is actually, believe it or not, a rough draft of it's already been written.
Ben handed me this essay on like Tuesday.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually, I don't expect it'll last for very long, but every now and again I do actually get on a better schedule and I'm ahead for a while. But yes, this is about capital. It's about the discussion of Aristotle in chapter 1 of Capital. So it's
Like
Marx versus Aristotle and the labor theory of value.
I liked it because it was kind of it's probably the person that Marx is nicest to in the whole book.
That's probably true. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because the gist of it is that even though he thinks he's wrong about this particular question, he like prefaces all of the critical stuff he says about Aristotle by saying Aristotle.
Yeah, he basically says like in his material conditions, he did as well as possibly could to understand the nature of labor.
Yeah, right. He clearly reveres Aristotle. He's like, yeah, Aristotle, who's this like towering genius, still got this wrong for these historical reasons we can understand, etc. But you're right, is by far the person who's nicest to in the whole book.
All right, goodbye, everyone. I'm going to go directly to bed.
Nice.
Bye.